Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Friday. We are going to be starting our webinar just about now. For everybody's information, this webinar is being recorded and will be available through the IAEM website at the end of the presentation. The PowerPoint with the links on it will also be available. You can see if you're following along on Twitter as well as in the webinar, you can see that we have this hashtag IAEMETC, where you can feel free to add commentary or tweet anything you see. And if you have any questions, please use either the chat box or the question box during the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. So our presentation today is Social Media Monitoring in Action, with the Napa Earthquake as a specific case study that we will be referring to. My name is Jennifer Lazo. I'm the Emerging Technology Caucus Secretary for the International Association of Emergency Management. I also work as an emergency manager for the City of Berkeley, and I've been a digital volunteer for the Red Cross for several years. This presentation is going to pull from a couple of different areas to show you a practical example of what can actually happen using social media to make real action items during an emergency. We're specifically looking at the Napa earthquake, which happened last fall. So let's go ahead and start by giving you some background on that. The Napa earthquake hit on August 24th, 2014 at very early in the morning at about 3:20 a.m. And it was felt quite significantly in the area of Napa and Vallejo along with American Canyon. Technically, the epicenter was in American Canyon, California. So the maps that are in front of you right now, one shows the shaking intensity in various locations. You can see that much of the Bay Area region felt a sort of 4 to 5 light to moderate shaking. So enough to wake people up generally in most parts of the Bay Area, but not enough to take anything off of shelves. However, in the places near the epicenter, it got up to heavy to very heavy shaking. If you haven't spent a lot of time with the USGS data, you can see that there's something called Pager on the right-hand side of the screen that takes the specific information of an earthquake about how much shaking there was and where it was located and makes a guess as to how many fatalities would be expected and how much economic loss would be expected. This is generated about 20 to 30 minutes after the earthquake, so it's just based on the science. It's not based on anything actually observed in the area. You can see that they got pretty close here. They predicted 0 to 1 fatalities. There was only 1 fatality in this earthquake, and they expected some pretty significant economic loss. So this was an early sign for me when I woke up from the earthquake that this wasn't just mild shaking felt somewhere far away. The shaking was actually going to have a pretty significant impact on the region. And I'm going to ask a quick quiz question, or not a quiz, a poll question for you all now. I would like to know what social media sites you use regularly. So if you could take a look at the poll that I just sent, I'm interested to see which ones you like using, have used before. All right, I'm seeing lots of responses coming in. Facebook is the clear and overwhelming winner here. But Twitter is making some pretty good comebacks as well as Instagram and other websites. Now, for those of you who are curious as to Tumblr or maybe have not used it before, if you heard anything interesting last night about the color of a dress, whether it was blue and black or white and gold, that post actually originally came from Tumblr and is an excellent example of how something that's posted in one location can transfer to other locations. So they often will cross-feed even if you don't know all of the other sites. So Facebook and Twitter were the main ones that came up in this poll, and that is pretty much what we're going to be looking at here as our major sources of information. Instagram is much harder to search because it's really a mobile-based platform. But there are some other sources of information as well that I'll show you. So I'm going to close this poll so we can go back to the screen. So now we're back on my PowerPoint here. So let's look a little bit at the effects on the Bay Area. The chart on the left is a pretty neat thing that we've seen for the first time for this earthquake. Jawbone is a system that's used to track people's sleep patterns so they can tell you whether or not you had a good night's sleep or a bad night's sleep. This chart shows how many people were asleep or were awake. and you can actually see where the earthquake hit on this chart. So that jumped right smack dab in the middle around 3 a.m. The blue line at the top is for Napa, Sonoma, Vallejo, Berkeley, so that area that was the closest to the earthquake. The green line is San Francisco, Oakland, and Santa Rosa. The black line, Sacramento and San Jose, and then the red line at the bottom is Modesto and Santa Cruz. So it's a very clear sign of who woke up for the earthquake and how long it took them to go back to sleep. I've actually seen another version of this chart that's just for the Napa and Vallejo area, and that line stays pretty much straight after it goes up. It does not, people didn't go back to sleep. So this is one of the examples of how the world of tech that we're living in, with wearables becoming a major thing, can be part of how we understand an earthquake and how strongly it was impacting people. So this is an up-and-coming technology that was interesting. So as I mentioned earlier, I actually work for the city and volunteer with the Red Cross. And one of the things that the city wound up very unofficially doing was people checked in with each other. Not any official response, but you can see on the right that there were several people that I work with who were saying, hey, we all woke up now. How are we doing? Everyone's okay? Excellent. So this is a conversation between several people that helped us connect very quickly after an earthquake in a time where we weren't necessarily needing to use our official systems. For most of the Bay Area, as I mentioned, there was not a major response. And so when I woke up very, very early in the morning, looked around, saw all my books were still on my shelves, I wanted to see, is this earthquake more significant elsewhere? And so I started going through searches on Twitter. These are some of the very initial tweets that came in that morning that showed that there was something happening in the Napa region. So the first tweet shows that USGS data that we learned earlier that showed there was going to be significant damage in certain areas. And some of these other tweets are people doing initial damage reports just from sort of stepping out their door and seeing what's around. The bottom left hand, for those of you who live in earthquake country, know that this is the immediate tweet. Most news sources will go instantly to the closest grocery store or liquor store to see how many things have fallen off the shelves, because there's almost always damage anywhere near the epicenter. So that tweet, not particularly surprising, not that concerning. It doesn't look good, but it doesn't look horrible. However, the tweet on the right, that is a much more concerning tweet. This is in downtown Napa at the Vinters Collective. That was an unreinforced masonry building. And it shows that there were actually some pretty significant examples of damage in the specific area that was being hit. So you can also see I've got a list of hashtags that are below here. These are some of the ones that were being used right after the earthquake, although not all of them. So San Francisco quake, SF quake, Bay Area quake, SFEQ. These were actually most of the initial ones that people woke up, they had no idea where the epicenter was, and they just started using hashtags for the region. Within an hour or two, once it became clear where the earthquake happened, the hashtags tended to switch over to the specific area where the earthquake was, with Napa Quake becoming really the largest hashtag. A little bit of conversation about how these hashtags happen. First of all, people have tried to force hashtags a lot of the times. They want to make a specific hashtag for that specific disaster. And that generally happens naturally. It very rarely happens on purpose. One of the local news networks in the area of the Bay Area actually tried to make their own special earthquake hashtag, and it never caught on. They were the only ones ever using it. And so for emergency managers and agencies who are trying to find out information, it's worthwhile to use a variety of tools to see what the most common hashtags are and go with those instead of trying to make up their own. And it's also really important for the neighborhood or community that's affected that that hashtag moved to exactly who it was. So it moved to Napa Quake instead of San Francisco Quake, because not really much of anything happened in San Francisco. So that would have been an inappropriate hashtag. This has been a challenge for some other earthquakes or disasters too, where there's a big location nearby and people start using that name instead of the area that was most heavily impacted. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of a now that you know a little bit more about the earthquake, a little bit of background about the Red Cross's digital volunteer program. The basic definition is that trained digital volunteers who have learned how the Red Cross works sign up for shifts to monitor, engage, and report on things happening on social media for 4 hours, and it can be done remotely anywhere. It's managed by the local area, but the volunteers who are helping out in these instances can come from all across the country. So a local region will say, we've had a disaster, we need some help, we need to get a good idea of what's happening on the internet. Hey, people from across the country, can you sign up for a shift to keep an eye on what's going on? So it's very similar to the VOST model, for those who have heard of that, where a local emergency manager makes a request and people from across the country or even across the world can provide information and data analysis that's useful for that local emergency manager. So the process for the response activation in this circumstance is that they would be the volunteers are activated again by the local region that was impacted, and then they use a variety of tools that have been pre-prepared for those volunteers. Some of that is basic earthquake safety information. So those are things like drop, cover, and hold on, or how to clean up after an earthquake, or what to do after a power outage. There's also talking points that the public affairs or PIO team come up with that can be shared. So that might be where the shelter locations are, or service delivery sites are. And then there's also emerging information from official sources. So if the school district announces that it's closed for the day, that might be information that a digital volunteer would help pass on if they saw a different post of someone saying, I don't know if I'm supposed to go to school today. And then these volunteers are sharing information, often using their personal accounts to answer people's questions or queries. And they're also finding information. So sometimes they'll find pieces of information and pass it on to their supervisor, which I'll go into in a little more depth in a minute. First, I'm going to ask one more poll question, which is, what is your experience using social media during an emergency? So if you have been in any kind of emergency, how were you interacting with social media? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to respond to that. So taking a look at the results here, it looks like a lot of people have monitored information from social media, started pulling information in, and sometimes shared information through official sources. And a decent number of people have used it personally but not professionally, which is often true. You'll hear about some disaster that happened in the nearby vicinity. Suddenly all of your friends and family will be asking, are you okay? Are you okay? And you'll post a status update to everyone saying, hey, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. So the monitoring is a little bit easier. Sometimes how to turn that monitoring of information into something you can take action on is more challenging. So that's what we're going to look at from here on out. So here are some examples of the types of tweets that were shared from the official Napa County Red Cross account. And these tweets are very important for the timing of them. One of the things that makes an earthquake different from a lot of the other disasters is that, first of all, it's unexpected, so people haven't had time to buy some extra water or make sure they have their flashlights available. And secondly, there's a distinct pattern of what happens, what people do after an earthquake. So first of all, people will be very concerned right after the shaking to know that it was actually an earthquake, that actually happened, and trying to figure out where the earthquake was. This is why you'll hear a lot of stories about people calling 911 centers to say, hey, was that an earthquake? 911 dispatchers are not particularly pleased with this, but they have had to deal with it quite a bit. And there have been a couple of studies, particularly in Los Angeles, that show that when an official agency Twitter or social media account says, yes, there was an earthquake, the number of people who call in to ask if there was one can go down significantly. So the first tweet that needs to happen is to acknowledge, yes, something has happened, we're looking into it. You don't even need to have more information than that. Although the next tweet that often follows that is pointing to other sources of official information like USGS to say, here's where you can find the official information on the earthquake. Next thing that people do after an earthquake, they get out of bed because they were having their cell phones in bed. That's where they sent that initial tweet, and start walking around, and then they might feel an aftershock. In that particular circumstance, they need to make sure that they have good shoes on, they have a flashlight, and that they know what to do if an aftershock were to hit. So these are the kinds of issues that you want to start addressing really close to when that earthquake happens. And these are things that we know are going to happen, so you can actually have them pre-scripted and ready to go. There is a link on the bottom right-hand side of this page that Mary Jo Flynn, who's the president of IAEM ETC, created with a ton of different kinds of disasters and the kinds of tweets you're going to want to send out after. So in an earthquake, that starts with acknowledging the earthquake, follows up with what to do during an aftershock. And then an hour or two later, or once daylight hits, you want to start thinking about tweets about how to clean up safely. This is one of those things of taking the data that we know from earthquakes and translating it into preparedness messages that are relevant. So, for example, we know that a lot of people will get injured about 6 hours after an earthquake because they will have been unsafe in trying to clean up broken glass. And this indeed happened in the Napa earthquake. So the morning after the earthquake, some of the most important messages were how to clean up correctly so they wouldn't get hurt, and also what to do if they could smell gas leaks. So these kinds of timely messages are very important. We did the power outage message while the power was still out. Once the power got back, we started doing messaging about how to know if your food is safe after a power outage. So really keeping an eye on the ongoing events. You can't just sort of make a whole slate of tweets, say go, and leave that be. You need to actually think about what's happening in the response to a disaster, and then how you want to acknowledge those things. A last example of a tweet that's on here is on the middle right-hand side, which was before going to sleep tonight, make sure that your bed is safe. This was actually one of the most popular tweets from this account during the day because it was an action people could practically do that helps them with their mental health and with their preparedness. So thinking of small-scale, reasonable actions that can be shared to a tweet, always linking back to where more information can be found, which is on there, and keeping the hashtag in there so it's part of an ongoing conversation that people in the area are having is a very powerful way to communicate. No, I don't want to share that. Sorry. Okay. Going on to the next slide. Where are sources of actionable information? So we've talked about what kind of message to share. Now, how can you get information from social media that you can take action on? One is Twitter. Twitter can be a really useful source immediately after the disaster. You saw those pictures of damage, which showed it wasn't just things off grocery shelves, that buildings were actually being affected. We also had people live tweeting the scanner feeds, which if you're part of a law enforcement agency, I'm sure you have a mixed to poor relationship with that particular thing. But it did show that there was some significant damage in the Napa and Vallejo areas if you listen to their scanner feeds. One thing that happened during the Napa earthquake that I at least personally hadn't seen before was hashtag takeovers. This is when a popular hashtag that's being used often during a disaster incident or anything popular really is taken over by an extremist group trying to put their own message in there. In this particular instance, it was ISIS that actually started posting highly graphic pictures of beheadings and other things like that into the Napa Quake hashtag, which definitely surprised me in that instance and made it almost impossible to just use the hashtag to search for information. A very quick fix to that problem was to use a geocoded search. That's when you use the latitude and longitude, draw a circle around the area in which you're searching, and say, I only want to see tweets using the hashtag in that area. This is something you can do on your basic Twitter information, and if you don't know how to do that, I'll share a link at the end of this presentation on exactly how to do a geocoded search. But that was a way to filter out instantly all of those people who are trying to take over the hashtag. So that can be a powerful tool. However, you might miss other kinds of conversations that are happening if people don't have their GPS on their phone. So that is one way to find local information. And it's again really important to watch how hashtags evolve and to use a lot of different kinds of searches to find it from Twitter. So you're not looking for one specific tweet saying something, you're looking for several tweets showing a trend. Another location is if your organization has a Facebook page, people will often post questions and inquiries onto that page. And this is one of those places where digital volunteers start making a lot of sense. If you ask in an EOC, hey, we need someone to look for posts on a Facebook page of this organization and answer them, that is going to be a very low priority for most PIOs or people in an EOC. It's also just getting that information, filtering out the ones you don't need to respond to, and giving basic information back is a job that a volunteer can do very easily. For example, someone says, my family really needs to go to the shelter, where is it? That's a piece of information that you can have on a press release that a volunteer just answers, or sends them to the school district's website if somebody has questions about school closures. So having someone, they don't even need to be logged into the page. With the Red Cross, we often answer these questions with personal Facebook pages, but having good references to information is a really useful way to use a digital volunteer. And they, again, don't need to be on site near EOC. Another good place to find ongoing trends is through local media Facebook pages. I'm not sure about your local town, but we have a couple of investigative reporters in the Bay Area, and many of them were up in Napa giving their hints and answering questions about how to respond to an earthquake very soon after the Napa earthquake. And people would ask all sorts of questions on their local media Facebook pages about what issues they were having in the earthquake. So this is a really good place to find trends. You might see that a lot of people from a certain area are saying, we're not seeing services here. That doesn't mean that necessarily services aren't happening here. It can mean a couple of things, that the services that are being offered aren't being explained well enough, and you need to start promoting them more. Or it might actually be a legitimate challenge that's happening in a certain part of the affected community. So what can you do if you start hearing that information? We're afraid that one neighborhood is being forgotten. This is where information that comes from a lot of different sources can be filtered into an EOC operation. So, for example, neighborhood X hasn't seen any help and they're badly damaged. Well, then neighborhood X, you share that with your operations section and say, hey, have we checked in with neighborhood X recently? And they might say, yes, we just had a damage assessment team over there. They're doing fine. They're doing okay. Or, no, we were told that they were okay, or we haven't had a chance to go over there. Maybe we'll send somebody. So this is not meaning necessarily that suddenly your entire response operation shifts to this neighborhood. But it means that you can check in and say, have we seen these people? Have we worked with them? And do we need to keep an eye on them? And sometimes just a quick phone call to say, oh yeah, neighborhood X is fine, or no, they're not, can mean a change in operation that was brought forward. So a tweet is almost never going, or a Facebook post, it's almost never going to completely shift how an operation is happening. But it can be a source of intelligence that can be tracked down, verified or shown as not true, and then turned into an action that can be taken. So that is an example, and that's one of the reasons you need to have a system in your EOC to take in that information. And a lot of people actually have this. It's just not social media based. So if you have a 311 number or some other way that people call in to ask, hey, roads are closed, that same group has already processing information that might need to have action. So if you can find a way to integrate that into that pre-existing system, you're going to be very successful in making it part of your EOC without having to create a completely new system. So another reason that digital volunteers can be very powerful is that you have a group taking action. And this group might have a lot of different skills and ability. I'm going to get back to translation skills in a minute because I have actual examples of that. But one of the most useful powers of a group is that they are awake and available at a variety of times. And so if you have people on the East Coast, they were already pretty close to being awake when this earthquake hit. Well, a lot of your people on the West Coast, they weren't awake yet, especially if they weren't in the impacted area. So you'll have people who can start monitoring immediately and start looking for information. I actually had some of my friends from the Emerging Technology Caucus who lived in different parts of the country sending me hashtags within the first hour of the disaster and useful accounts so that I could see what they were doing. Because they had a couple minutes. It was a Sunday morning. They could look around and see where useful information was coming out of. And they were already awake, so they had that skill and ability. Another wonderful thing for digital volunteers is that they get to practice their skills more often than people who only can respond locally, because the response isn't dependent on the location. As a digital volunteer, I've worked with hurricanes, I've worked with tornadoes, I've worked with ice storms, and I've worked with earthquakes and wildfires. As a general volunteer, most of those things don't happen to me in California, but I get a chance to practice my skills on incidents that are happening elsewhere as long as I've been requested by that group to do it. So it's a really good way that people can continue to practice their skills and have the opportunity to learn. One of the challenges, however, that does come with that is regionally specific disasters. For example, windstorms and power outages can happen pretty much anywhere in the country. That's pretty consistent. So knowing what to tell people about if their power went out is a message that your digital volunteers pretty much anywhere in the country are going to be able to deal with. However, somebody from the East Coast may be very unfamiliar with what to tell people to do during an aftershock. And that's why if you're going to use people in a VOST team or in any other kind of volunteer team that are from areas that don't necessarily know the local disasters, it might be worth it to make a guide that tells people, here are the things you need to know, here's a quick reference sheet on what to share about this kind of disaster. Now, jumping back up to the translation skills question, I had the wonderful relationship with a person in Florida who spoke Spanish. And so when we would have a tweet, this volunteer would translate the tweet into Spanish so we could share it. And there was actually a large Spanish-speaking community in Napa that was affected. Many of the grape pickers, because it was the height of the grape picking season, mainly spoke Spanish. And so being able to translate these tweets was great. And our volunteer who was doing that translation was in Florida. So that was a resource that was available. This person was happy to do it. I was very grateful for his efforts. And it made our feed a lot more accessible to many more people within the area. So that's another benefit of having people from all over. A skill you might not have locally, you might be able to get a volunteer from. So I spoke a little bit earlier about taking information and making it actionable. So here's an example of how where that information goes. It starts with a volunteer spotting a trend. It's not just one tweet, as I mentioned earlier, but they might see a couple of questions on a Facebook post, a couple of tweets about an incident, and maybe even a news article that's starting to talk about something. And they say, this looks like something that you might want to look into more. Those tweets and posts related to that trend are then passed on to a supervisor who looks them over, makes sure that they're not from some weird source. You know, if it's a shark swimming in the streets, guess what? It didn't actually happen. So somebody who is a little more experienced of knowing how to validate images, for example, can then make sure that the images are actually from this disaster and not something else, and can translate them into a report, an informational report, just the same way a 911 call coming into the system could be translated and given to the operations section. Then, so it's handed to someone in operations who's going to receive that information and decide, does this look like something we need to take action on or not? It's validated on the ground through other trusted sources, and then action can be taken if it's appropriate. So that's a big picture concept. Last thing I want to talk about here, and then I am going to move towards the questions section of this presentation, is how to integrate your social media response with your on-the-ground response. First of all, it's key that there's someone in your EOC or someone in your command area where you're running the response who is coordinating with your digital people. You do need someone on the ground who can go and talk to the sheltering people and say, hey, is this really where the shelter is located right now, or did we move it? Who can validate those questions that are coming through. So somebody will need to be there. It doesn't necessarily need to be their full-time job, but you're going to need to have someone who can act as that liaison between your digital volunteers and your people on the ground. And that person really should be trusted by the responders on the ground, because this concept of using information from the internet can be a little sketchy for some people who've been doing this for a long time. And so you want someone who they're going to respect and say, no, really, we actually need to look into this information. Another really important aspect of doing an integrated response is working with your partner organizations to amplify each other. I spoke a couple of months ago to someone from the California Office of Emergency Services who said every night she would look over the tweets after the Napa earthquake and retweet the ones that were out there that had useful information messages. So working through what information everybody has. Maybe the Humane Society has good information on pets. Maybe a child's mental health service has good information to tell parents whose kids are afraid to sleep on their own after a disaster happens. So making sure to find the validated, useful sources of information, preferably partners you already had before the incident, and sharing it back and forth can make a much stronger network during a disaster. One thing that anyone who's run a social media account during a disaster knows is that your follower count will go up significantly during that disaster if you have useful information on the account. If not, people will just get very angry at you. If you have a dead social media account and a disaster happens and you don't post anything on that account, it's not going to be very well received by the community. There have been some instances in Southern California where that recently happened, and it was really did not go over well. So if you're going to have an account at all, make sure that you have somebody who's ready to use it during the incident. Another thing that you can do is pull social media into your operation on the ground. This is often called live tweeting. And so it might mean that if you have, say, teams of people who are doing damage assessments a week after the disaster, it might be a great idea to send one of your people from public affairs or public information out with a cell phone to show what a day in the life of a damage assessor looks like. Show some of the damage in the city, show some of the information of the work they're doing. It makes it clear that people are continuing to work hard to help respond to this disaster. Sometimes it's really hard for the number 52 buildings were inspected and found to have minor or major damage to actually turn into what is a city, what is a county, what is a nonprofit organization doing in this disaster. Having someone actually throughout the day sending messages is a really powerful tool to show, oh, this is what it looks like. These are the actions that are being taken. One other important thing I want to mention is that within the Red Cross, we often use public affairs to go through to feed the message into the system, but it's not necessarily the only way, and it can't just be a public affairs response. You can't just leave it with your public information team. It needs to be something that the operations team, other people, are able to access the information, find out trends, and share information. So you might have people that are in your public works section of your EOC who really need to be able to share be able to find a system where people can tell them where there are big cracks in the road so they can go respond to them quickly. That would be a reason that public works in your operations section needs to be able to talk to your public affairs team to say, hey, can we make a Twitter system or a Facebook system where people post where they're seeing damage to streets? There's also a couple of new websites like SeeClickFix that your public works department might already be using within your city that would be very useful after a disaster. So there's some good information that FEMA has been working with that website, for example, to figure out how that could be a disaster usage. The other important thing to think about is that a strong base of social media responders makes this possible. This is something that is very hard to come up with when an incident happens if you haven't done any groundwork in the first place. If you haven't thought about how you're going to use social media in your organization, if you haven't spent some time cultivating volunteers or cultivating even professionals who know things about social media, you're going to have a very difficult time actually using it within a real response. So I recommend now is the time. There's a lot of excellent trainings out there. There's a lot of great resources for people. You don't have to do crazy things. You don't have to have an incredibly complex system. You don't have to buy crazy software. But you do need to start experimenting and making a regular presence with your volunteers and with your community so people know that social media can be a good place to share and get information. So now I'm going to open this up to questions. I'm not sure. I'm going to take a quick look at who's on here. So if you would like to ask any questions, I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to look at my question tab yet. I'm pulling that out now. And hopefully you all can't see it. But if you want to raise your hand as an attendee, I would be happy to unmute you and let you ask a question. Oh, I see a hand raised. Okay, here we go. Lance Charnes, go ahead. You should be unmuted, hopefully. Lance? Maybe, maybe not. He's on the question tabs, no audio. I am sorry, Lance. I'm totally messing this up. Usually I have someone to help me with this bit. Oh, okay. I'm going to just pull a couple of questions from the questions tab, and then hopefully I can figure out the system. I am going to copy the links into chat boxes, so I will do that. I see that. You will get something at the end of this. You're going to get a survey, and I can help you. We will have a list of attendees for those who attended this webinar. So, and if we want to, if a certificate would be useful for this kind of thing, we'll see what we can do about that. Some other useful sources of information to look for during these kinds of disasters are Reddit, Instagram, and possibly Yik Yak. So in our last presentation that we did in the sequence, Sarah Miller talked about most of these systems. Some of them are easier and some of them are harder to use. Reddit during a disaster is often very active. So if you have someone who's an expert on that, they might be a really good person that's looking for information for you. And Yik Yak, if you are near a college or university, is another thing that usually during the day is going to be very silly. There's going to be nothing useful in there. But if an incident's actually happening, people will often talk about it, that incident specifically. For example, during the Napa earthquake, when if I had done a basic geocoded search of the area within 10 kilometers of Napa, California, before the earthquake happened, I would have found people talking about what they ate for dinner. I would have found people talking about a TV show they were watching. It would have been almost entirely irrelevant. When I did that geocoded search at 3:30 in the morning after the earthquake, I would say about 95% of the tweets were related to the earthquake. This was without using a hashtag, without using any kind of search. All it was everyone who's tweeting within that area. The vast majority of the tweets were an earthquake. And that is one of the things that Yik Yak actually provides in and of itself. It's already geolocated, so that could be a really useful source of information. Okay, for how to figure out which hashtags to follow since they tend to happen organically. That's a really great question. So it's one of the things where there are a variety of hashtag mappers out there. I'm not actually the best expert. This is where I had a friend find some of them for me. So for my social media people like Scott Reuter, who I see are in here, if you could post some links to some of these. I know Tweetfall is one of them. Trends Mapper is another. There are a variety of websites where some of which you have to pay to get really specific, but you can at least find the big trending hashtags. And frankly, one of the easiest ways is when you sign on to Twitter, on the left-hand side, you can say, what's trending in San Francisco? That's really the basic, simple thing I used right at the beginning in order to find out what hashtags were trending. But the thing is, you can't just set a couple in the first hour after the disaster and then never look at it again. So that's one of the keys. Okay. The Twitter hashtag for this presentation is IAEM-ETC. Thank you. Yes. A comment on geocoding. A lot of tweets are not geocoded. So GeoSearch isn't perfect, which is absolutely true. A lot of people, it's actually one of the ironies of geocoded searches. For people who really know what they're doing for Twitter during a disaster, they might remember to turn on their location. For people who, in general, know what they're doing on social media, have almost always turned off their location. And so people who only sort of know what they're doing on social media are ironically the ones most likely to have their location on. Because it's usually the automatic setting of the app on the phone, and people have to go turn it off if they don't want it to work. So geolocation isn't perfect, but if you are getting a whole lot of noise during a disaster and you need to sort it down, it is a very quick way to deal with that noise. Okay, the listing of safety tips following the incident, I will have Mary Jo Flynn will undoubtedly tweet it right now since I'm asking her nicely. So if you look at Mary Jo, Twitter to @MaryJoFly, which is she will almost undoubtedly have her link tweeted so that you can click on it instantly. I don't have it saved right now. Reddit, somebody was asking, is spelled like that. Sorry for the confusion, any confusion there. This is an interesting question. Regarding the LAX active shooter incident, can you go over how important social media played? As the public was stranded awaiting response, social media seemed to inform all involved. For example, it informed the public before the airlines were able to. This is very true. So as someone might have noticed in my profile, I was also helping not in the social media realm. So let me be clear, I was not actually doing social media for the LAX shooting, but I did watch a lot of what was happening. And this is a really good example where people were actually able to ask each other questions when that happened, because many people were evacuating from the airport, actually just walking down the street away from the airport to get out of the area, which made for a very complicated situation. People were trying to communicate with their loved ones of where they should get picked up. Traffic was completely crowded, and information was needed. And the airlines were struggling to find information as well, as was the airport. So the airport's Twitter account, first of all, is a day-to-day active account. If you follow the LAX Twitter account, you will see them giving recommendations to people about where to get a meal before their flight. They'll be giving weather updates for when flights might be delayed. So it's a place people already knew existed where they could get information, and it continued to share specific incident information during the disaster. It might not always have been as quick as people wanted it to be, but it was actually a very effective system. And a really good example of if you already have an active social media response, you're going to be doing much better for other things. Okay. Are there any examples of social media-focused disaster exercises? This is a really good question. These have happened in different places. For those of you who have not seen Cheryl Bledsoe's video on how to safely exercise social media, I hope that we can get someone to also tweet that link for me. I'm sorry, I'm making all sorts of people just do things and hoping that they're doing it, because I can only monitor so much of this at once. But hopefully we can get that link up. The important thing about using social media and exercises is that you never want to tweet into the real social media atmosphere information that looks like a disaster is happening, because people will get very confused. They might think something's actually happening. If you've ever heard stories about people overhearing scanners during exercises and thinking a real disaster is happening, that can happen on social media as well. It will also often have people tune out from what they were doing. So that is one thing to be careful of, but I do know that some of our friends in the internet world have done some really good social media exercises. Another great way to do that is to monitor big events that are coming up. So we've missed the Super Bowl and the Oscars. Those just happened. But learning how to find emerging hashtags in the Super Bowl is a really good thing to look. And if you looked last night when suddenly black and blue and white and gold became trending hashtags all across the country, that's the kind of example of seeing a hashtag emerge quickly. So you can, during normal day-to-day events, you can actually start seeing some good tools. I'm seeing some good recommendations for different kinds of tools for doing some monitoring. So Topsy.com is one that Scott Reuter enjoys using. Thank you, Scott. I have used TweetDeck, which is an official app from Twitter. I've also used Hootsuite. I've used a variety of other free sources that are just available on the internet. I really do a lot of Twitter monitoring, and for Facebook, I do it by going to specific pages. So I don't just search all of the Facebook posts. Another trend that tends to happen after a disaster is that people will make specific pages for the disaster. So it might be a Napa business recovery page where all the Napa businesses are on there. It's another great way to find information. And so it's just a lot of using a lot of different tools and finding things different ways. And Scott wants me to know that Topsy lets you look at 3 tags or keywords side by side and on a graph. So thank you, Scott. This presentation will be available for viewing at a later date for those who are asking. How can a county or local level emergency manager engage a group of volunteers to be social media communicators? Do you have best practice documents on how to get that started? As a matter of fact, we do. For those who have not spent any time looking at VOFT, which is what I just typed into the chat box right now, If you search VOST, you are going to find really good information about how to start up social media monitoring. Where you're going to find those people depends. If you have a local college or university or even high school, you might find some great volunteers there who are going to know all of the most recent local social media trends. If you have a CERT group or a ham radio group, some of those people might also be really good at social media. So those are all places to start. We will be sharing some links, I'm sure, on social media to where you can find some of that information. Oh, Scott posted exercising safely in social media for me, so let me post that link for everybody. Come on. If it likes me today, which it might not. I apologize for the funness of this system. Okay, I'll try to do that in a minute. I will provide a list of the recommended sites. I'm going to do, since I now know what we've talked about today, I will add a page to this PowerPoint, and it will have all of the websites that people talked about. And Scott gave me the VOST website, which is www.vosg.us. So great place to find a lot of tools on how to start out with making a team of volunteers. Yes. Lloyd Colston has a really wonderful comment, which is that not all tools work all the time. Use more than one. So Hootsuite or Twitterfall, those are all kinds of tools that might be useful. Some days, some are going to work better than others. So being able to jump from one to another can be very useful. Here's another great question. Do you have any guidance or templates of local social media policies for local OEMs? So yes, this is always a really fun issue on how to do it. And first of all, I want to point out that social media policies can be two things. They can be social media policies for your actual employees on what you want them to say, or social media policies for the organization on what organization official accounts are saying. So first of all, one thing to think about is if you're going to have a policy for the people who are working or volunteering for you, or if you're just going to have a policy for your official accounts. There are some really great resources out there where you can find pretty much everyone's social media policies online, including the Red Cross's current policies. I am, again, trusting in the power of the Internet for somebody to share that link. I don't know the exact link off the top of my head, but I will put it in the slideshow. So I apologize for all of this, me not having the links right there. But there really are a lot of very powerful ways. And if you email me with any of these questions, too, I can share them with you. But one of the great things, I've seen a couple of great ones from Seattle. I've seen some very good ones from Mountain View that are posted online that show how social media policies can be adapted. But make sure that you work within your own legal department to figure out what your lawyers think will work best for you. Okay, last chance for any questions. I thank you all for such great questions. This is a lot. There's a lot of good stuff in here, and hopefully this presentation has been useful for you. This is part of our series, by the way. Are there any recommended resources for more seasoned folks to get some training on Twitter and other websites? One of the best ways to start, FEMA has an online class that gives you some very basics about those kinds of social media websites. And then I really recommend that you look into the NDPTC class. PTC, which is available throughout the country. It's a training course on the basics of social media, where you can learn how to send a tweet, learn how to do a variety of things. And so that is a really good way to learn the basics in a safe environment where you've got people sort of guiding you through, and I highly recommend that. There's also new NDPTC courses in the pipeline for people who've gone through the first one and want to learn more. So there are a couple that are coming up that are going to be very exciting on social media engagement and intermediate, come on Sarah, finish me out here, intermediate social media skills. Yes. Okay, so if you look at their website, which is ndptc.hawaii.edu, you can find some great information there. As to what's coming next, somebody asked that question. Here's one opportunity I want to make sure that people know about. If you are a social media person, We've got a really great opportunity with our IAEM bulletin that's coming up with a whole section on social media and emergency management. So this is something that's coming up. For people who are working on these articles, Sarah Miller, who is one of our members of ETC, is very willing to help people. Her Twitter account is @SCBA. So if you're not already following her, she's awesome, but she can help you. And we're looking for a lot of interesting articles on how to use social media between 715 and 1,500 words. Lessons learned, how you reached out, whatever it is that you're working on, we're hoping to have some really exciting articles to show you the latest and greatest of what's happening. Our next Emerging Technology Caucus meeting is the first Friday of the month, so it is Friday, March 6th, and we are going to be having some people talking about some of the latest and greatest there. We often have a speaker from a social media or from a technology organization to talk about recent innovations. We've in the past had people talking about FirstNet, have people talking about Nextdoor. Hootsuite is going to be coming to the next meeting. So these are going to be really great opportunities to find out what's going on. You do not have to be an expert to come and join us on these calls. It's a great way to learn. And we are still working on what exactly our next webinar will be. You're about to get a survey quiz once I close out this, where we would like to have ideas on what you want to learn. So pretty please answer those questions so that we can do that. For those who would like to sign up in the meeting, once I've posted this PowerPoint, you're going to see a link. You can also go to www.iaem.com, in which you can go to the Caucus section. You'll see Emerging Technology Caucus as an option, and you will find out information about how to join the caucus and where our conference calls are. Okay, a couple of other things that people wanted me to mention. The NDPTC courses are free. The website is, I'm going to put it into the chat box here. Okay, so that's where you can find those courses. I thank you all so much for your excellent questions and your excellent attentiveness. Please, please, please fill out the survey so we know what we can offer next. And I look forward to working with you all in the future on doing disaster preparedness and using social media. Have a wonderful day, everybody.